Hello, this is IPO Swords, and today we're going to talk about this. This antique sword is a model of 1882 French Infantry Officers sword, just like the one in the previous episode. However, unlike the previous regulation model, this is an entirely custom-made sword. It is extremely highly decorated, utilizing various forms of decoration including frost etching on the blade and chisel engraving on the hilt. But beyond the highly decorated nature of this sword, it is also more functional than the regulation model, being made to a higher standard and with overall larger dimensions. In comparison to the standard 1882 French Infantry Officers sword, we can see that this hilt is significantly larger. In fact, it has an extra bar on it. This is a 3-bar hilt, whereas this is a 4-bar hilt. This 4-bar hilt provides extra protection to the hand, covering it entirely when it is held in a guard position. Beyond the fact that there is an extra loop on this guard, you'll also note that each of these has a reinforcing bar down the center of it. These reinforcing ridges are not present on the standard 1882. The presence of these reinforcement ridges increases the amount of complexity in casting a guard like this, and thus increases cost. However, I would posit that cost was no consideration in the production of this particular example. On the entirety of the hilt, there is a fine lattice of decoration in a floral theme, including vines, leaves, and grapes. These decorations were applied most likely with a hand chisel of a very fine diameter. But beyond that, the backstrap was very elaborately carved in a fairly deep relief, including the initials of the owner, either CS or SC. I can't entirely tell. The hilt is therefore both more protective and more decorative. It does, however, share some similarities. Much like the standard 1882, it has a vertically aligned sword knot loop. However, I do not have a sword knot that matches it. This vertically aligned sword knot indicates where this sword may have served. Vertically and horizontally aligned sword knots often served in the French army to differentiate between colonial and French officers' swords. Moving beyond the hilt, which is extremely highly decorated as noted, but also highly functional, we see something very similar in the blade. This sword is 7 centimeters longer than the standard pattern, being 107 centimeters overall. It's also significantly heavier as a result of the increased mass in the hilt and in the blade, being 895 grams compared to 690 grams on the regulation model. If you look carefully, you'll also note that this is a broader sword. If you were to measure it with calipers, you'd note that it's also a thicker sword. As a result, this is an incredibly stiff sword for its weight. This stiffness is conducive to both cutting and thrusting, as a stiffer sword is easier to get through a target in a cut and allows you to penetrate better into even heavily clothed targets wearing something like a greatcoat. The blade on this has never been sharpened. It has, however, been nickeled and decorated after the fact. There are the very slight remnants of 2 stamps that indicate that this blade was Klingenthal manufactured. However, due to the nickel coating, which was applied very heavily on this sword to prevent it from corroding and keep it shiny, I cannot distinguish what inspector's marks these are. There is, however, an etching panel, which runs for approximately 20 centimeters of the blade. The etching panel on one side features only a floral motif, which you can see on screen now. On the other side, the blade says 17 Juillet 1896, or the 17th of July 1896, indicating when this sword was manufactured, or at least completed manufacturing. The blade is therefore, like the hilt, decorated and highly functional. This sword, as mentioned, is 895 grams, 205 grams heavier than the regulation pattern. However, it is still a very wieldy sword. It balances at a very reasonable distance from the hilt, considering its length, and would have been well suited to perhaps a mounted infantry officer who was well off and could afford a horse, or alternatively someone who preferred to keep distance from their opponents and wanted a longer sword. I will note that several lengths of blade were relatively standard in French swords, with an A, B, and C indicating standard, slightly longer, and significantly longer. I believe this would be a C-length blade. being 107 centimeters, it's significantly longer than the standard model. The idea that this might have been used by someone who was mounted is bolstered by the fact that it has this extra loop on the guard. An extra bar on the guard would have been perhaps more of a problem on foot, as it would get in the way while marching. On horse, it makes less of an impingement on your mobility, and also makes more sense when presenting the point to the enemy, as it allows you to protect your hand. I'm going to bring this closer to the camera now, so we can look at its details up close and admire the beauty which is this French 1882. Now that we can see this sword up close, you can see the details with which this was constructed, including the aforementioned floral decorations and the reinforcing ribs, both of which are absent on the standard model. I'll also reiterate that this has 3 bars, whereas the custom version has 4 bars, with this extra bar being the one that was added on the outside. I'll also note that both of them do have a reinforced front bar. This was standard across almost all 1882s and is not a custom feature. It does significantly increase the strength of these hilts, allowing them to be combat effective. If we turn this sword around, you'll note the difference in colour, with this sword being significantly more brown than this sword. This indicates a different source of horn. However, I cannot conclusively say whether that's simply a different cow, as they would have had variations in the colour of their horn. While we're here, let's have a look at the backstrap, which I mentioned is extremely highly decorated. As you can see, the floral motif continues on this backstrap, with a vine leaf down the entire length of it. At the end of the backstrap, you can see that there is a emblematic representation of the initials of the owner of this sword, being SC or CS. And if we begin to look at the quillant here, you can see that there is a slight amount of texturing that was applied to it in order to increase the amount of textural complexity on this casting. Here you can also see the engraving on the blade, which as mentioned says 17 Juillet 1896 or the 17th of July 1896. The entirety is covered in a floral motif of vine leaves, as well as a floral decoration here near the hilt, which covers the inspector's mark in both etching and nickel coating. As mentioned on the obverse side of this sword, we can see more vine leaf motifs and no writing, and we can also see that the initial inspector's mark has been obscured by the nickel coating. I'm not sure how easy it is to tell, but side by side you may be able to appreciate the difference in width in this blade, this one being substantially thicker than the regulation pattern. I hope you've enjoyed this video, because that's all I have for today. Until next time, stay sharp.